Welcome to the program.
Hello, everyone.
Hello. Wherever you're at in San Francisco, London, Athens, New York, Tokyo, wherever you might be tuning in from, welcome to Castoriadis and Autonomy in the 21st Century. It's a book about all things related to the Autonomous Project, but particularly related to our book and how we trying to apply the ideas of the autonomous philosopher Cornelius Castoriadis in the 21st century, and the way we interpret those ideas and the things we extrapolate from the world today. I'm Chris Spannos, one of the co-authors, and why don't you two introduce yourselves?
Hello, everyone. I am Alexandros Schismenos. I am one of the co-authors of the book Castoriadis and Autonomy. And I have a PhD in philosophy, studying the work of Castoriadis. And I have also worked with his ideas on a practical level as a political activist of member of social movements. Nikos?
Εγώ είμαι ξυλουργός, είμαι και δάσκαλος ξυλουργικής και με τον Καστοριάδη έχω μια σχέση από μικρό παιδί. Με προσέλκυσε ο Καστοριάδης από όταν ήμουν μικρό παιδί, γιατί η πολιτική άρχισε να με ενδιαφέρει από όταν ήμουν στην εφηβεία ακόμη. Αυτή είναι η σχέση μου με τον Καστοριάδη και είμαι και εγώ ένας από τους συγγραφείς του βιβλίου.
Nikos is the third co-author of the book, and he's a carpenter and also a teacher of carpentry, and he has been in touch with Castoriadis' ideas through his political involvement in social movement from a teenage age. He had come in contact with Castoriadis' ideas and political theory from a teenage age, and that has informed his political activity as a member of social movements.
And I come from a media activist background primarily for the past 2 decades, and was a social service worker for a period, and working in radical left media after that. I've worked for all types of self-managed media, cooperative media, collectively run media, state socialist media, all kinds of media, except for really corporate media. But here we are, and we're presenting this collaborative work that we've been through, and really trying to apply these ideas to social movements and histories, and from our own experience participating in social movement experiences throughout the first part of the century so far. And so what's coming up on this episode is really exciting. We're going to be introducing some of the key concepts in the philosophical canon of Castoriadis, those being autonomy as one concept. Another concept that's very closely related to that is heteronomy, and likewise barbarism. So these 3 concepts we'll talk about, we'll introduce, we'll dive into them, we'll try to dig up some past and examples, some present examples, and think about what the implications are for the future, and so. But before doing that, we want to talk a little bit about Castoriadis' experience, and just explain for those of you who may not know a little bit more about Cornelius Castoriadis, and this philosopher who was a militant and a unique thinker, and had a very wide array of experiences and influencing the period of his time, just as this time had influenced him, and this is a very interesting biographical experience that I believe Alexandros and Nikos, you're both going to say a bit more about now.
Yes. Well, in a broader sense, Castoriadis is one of the most prominent philosophers, but also political thinkers and activists of the 20th century. His life spans from 1922 to 1997, the whole range of this turbulent century, and he was active in many political events. He was a member of the Marxist movement and the Trotskyist movement, but he became a radical critic of Marxism after 1970, and he was one of the few, probably the only one of his generation, to denounce Marxism in order to save the revolutionary project, or as he later called it, the project of autonomy. This is the broader sense. In more specific, we should say that he was born in Istanbul in 1922, and his family moved to Athens after the defeat of the Greek forces in Kemal, before Kemal. He became a member of the Greek Communist Party during the German Nazi occupation of Greece, but he also became denounced the Stalinist Communist Party during the Nazi occupation to become a member of the Trotskyist group led by the revolutionary figure of Agistinas, Spiros Triftis, who was a Greek worker and the co-founder of the communist movement in Greece. After the war and before the Greek civil war between the communists and the monarchists, Castoriadis was lucky enough to gain a scholarship alongside other Greek intellectual students from the French Institute, and moved to Paris in 1945. And then he became a member of the Trotskyist party in 1945, but next year he became a critic of the Trotskyist orthodox view that the Soviet Union was, how can I say, a devolved workers' state, by pointing out first among a few that there was a new exploitative class rising in the Soviet Union, namely bureaucracy. And this led him to question the basic tenets of Marxist theory, and and became a co-founder of the legendary magazine journal Socialisme Barbarism, along with Claude Lefort, Jean-Luc Léotard, and other known French intellectuals. The magazine ended in 1967 after Castoriadis' criticism of Marxism and his denouncement of the Marx theory of history and the Marxist economic interpretation of the social historical. And then he became involved with psychoanalysis. He was one of the figures, the intellectual figures that had an important influence on the events of May 68. And he became a psychoanalyst after 1970. And in 1975, he published his magnum opus, The Imaginary Institution of Society, which posed a whole different open perspective of revolutionary change, of social creativity, and of human existence. And then, until 1997, he remained one of the proponents of the possibility of a radical social change towards autonomy. He continued to inspire social movements and social and political radical thought. And he was one of the few in his generation that did not denounce the whole revolutionary project due to his criticism of the Soviet Union. And then he was justified, of course, in 1989 when in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, and his criticism, which he expressed already in 1946, became widely accepted among, the radical political spectrum. But besides that, I think that he is one of the most prominent philosophers as well, since he made the radical criticism not only of Marxism, but of the whole philosophical tradition, pointing out some of the limitations and some of the aspirations that have failed in the project of modernity. We will have the time to discuss all that, I'm sure, in the following. This was the longest version, but we will have the time to discuss. It's very important, though, to point out that in Greece, after the fall of the junta in 1974, Castoriadis and was one of the main, and Spannos, he's the mentor, political in Greece, were one of the main influences of the Greek anarchist movement, which rose after decades of oblivion, because it gave a revolutionary perspective that went beyond Marxism and beyond the constraints of Marxist ideology, which was very dominant in the Greek revolutionary movement after the October events in Russia. Well, that's what I wanted to say.
And Nikos.
Τώρα μιλάμε για την προσωπική μας σχέση, πώς ήρθαμε σε επαφή με τον Καστοριάδη. Έτσι. Όπως είπα και πριν, είναι από μικρό παιδί με προσέλκυσε ο Καστοριάδης, από την εποχή της ένταξής μου στο αναρχικό κίνημα του Αγρινίου, δηλαδή γύρω στα 17 μου χρόνια. Και ακριβώς επειδή ενηλικιώθηκα πολιτικά μέσω της ρήξης με τον σοσιαλισμό και τον κομμουνισμό, πριν, στην εφηβεία μου ήμουνα στο Σοσιαλιστικό Κόμμα, τα βιβλία του Καστοριάδη με βοηθούσαν αρκετά για την επιβεβαίωση αυτής της ιδεολογικής ρήξης, δηλαδή η κριτική του Καστοριάδη στον μαρξισμό και ειδικά στη φαντασιακή θέσμηση της κοινωνίας, με συγκλώνησε και με τοποθέτησε πολιτικά.
Nikos is saying that he became in contact with the ideas of Castoriadis at that historical point after the fall of the junta in Greece in 1974, when he was a teenager, and when he became first involved with the, when I say newly emerging anarchist movement in Greece. Castoriadis' writings, and especially the imaginary institution of society, helped Nikos inform his political ideas through a rupture with the socialist and Marxist paradigms and prominent, dominant, how can I say, political parties that were there in Greece. So he became one of the main influences that informed the Greek anti-authoritarian movement.
Στη μικρή πόλη από την οποία κατάγουμε, από την οποία κατάγεται και ο Αλέξανδρος, οι ιδέες του Καστοριάδη εκείνη την εποχή, δηλαδή στις αρχές της δεκαετίας του 80, διαδόθηκαν στο Αγρίνιο γύρω από το περιοδικό, από το αναρχικό περιοδικό Ελευθεριακή Κίνηση, ήδη από το 1981, και αυτό αποτελεί μοναδική περίπτωση στην Ελλάδα αναρχική με τόσο ιδιαίτερη σχέση με τον Καστοριάδη.
And the small city of Western Greece, where we both come from, which is named Agrinio, and has had a prominent history of workers' movement from the beginnings of the 20th century. The days were first publicized through the foundation of a journal named Ελευθεριακή Κίνηση, libertarian movement in a way, and it was one of the first journals that were part of the anarchist movement that had so much influence and discussion about Castoriadis' ideas. So we had this small paradox that we have this small city in Greece of about 100,000 people, but where Castoriadis' ideas are also discussed in the public spaces since 1981 through the activity of the teenage then, but workers, people of the market, I would say, anarchists.
Εκείνη την εποχή γνωρίσαμε και τον Άγη Στίνα, τον Σπύρο Πρίφτη, τον μέντορα του Καστοριάδη, όπως είπε πριν και ο Αλέξανδρος, ο οποίος μας μετέφερε πολλά πράγματα από την για τον Κορνήλιο Καστοριάδη, και για την δική του εφηβική ηλικία και μετεφηβική ηλικία και πώς ενηλικιώθηκε και πολιτικοποιήθηκε ο Καστοριάδης. Πολλά πράγματα μας έλεγε για αυτά ο Στίνας. Ο Στίνας που εκείνη την περίοδο στην Ελλάδα είχε έρθει πολύ κοντά με κάποιους αναρχικούς.
And Nikos says that they also met at the late 70s with Agistinas, Spiros Trifidis, as I said, who was a founding member of the Greek communist movement in the late 20s. And after that, as an old person, he was a mentor of Castoriadis, and he had come very close with the anarchist circles. And Stinas described to them the workings of their revolutionary group during the occupation and Castoriadis' teenage years as well, his earliest political activities. So there was also, how can I say, a continuation of generations around the person of Castoriadis and his comrades. For example, I had also the luck and honor to meet Yannis Tamtakos, another revolutionary worker and Trotskyist and member of this group that as an old 80-year-old activist in Thessaloniki, he shared his experience with Castoriadis as well. Castoriadis was 20 years old when the Nazi occupation happened, and he found himself alongside the other members of this Trotskyist group among both fires, both from the German Nazi occupation forces and their fascist collaborators in Greece, but also from the Stalinist party, Communist party, who used the resistance fronts in order to quietly eradicate the opposition from the left. And that was also the period when the last Trotskyist and anarchist group vanished from Greece.
So, just to summarize a little bit, so Castoriadis was a member of the Communist Party from the age of 13, and
yes,
left when he became critical of the Communist Party and the Stalinist politics of the Communist Party and the bureaucracy of the Soviet Union, or the dictatorship of the Soviet Union. And as part of the Trotskyist movement in Greece, the Stalinist movement wanted to attack him, ideally assassinate him from the left, and from the right, the Nazi forces also wanted to kill him.
Yes, and his biographer Francois Dos describes how he narrowly escaped being arrested by the Gestapo, and how he narrowly escaped an assassination attempt, which unfortunately, by the Stalinist party, which unfortunately managed to murder one of his young comrades, Demosthenis Voursoukis, which was 20 years old, and he was said to be the most prominent thinker of the little group that included Castoriadis. He was murdered. Castoriadis escaped.
I have Dos's book right here for anyone interested in knowing more about Castoriadis. It's a fantastic book. But yeah, so what happened next? How did Castoriadis go to France? How did he end up there?
Well, that's an interesting adventure. It is an adventure not only for Castoriadis, but for a whole generation of Greek people that became prominent intellectuals in France afterwards during the 60s, because the director of the French Institute in Greece saw that during the German occupation and afterwards, a civil war was coming between the communist forces and the monarchist forces, and he decided to break up some scholarships that the French institution used to give, and give the permission at about 100 Greek prominent students to go and study in France. And Castoriadis was one of them, and among them were other prominent Greek thinkers like Kostas Papaioannou and Kostas Axelos, which became a professor in Germany and is well known as well, and Tika Granaki, which was a painter, and many more. This ship called Mataroa has been, this journey of Mataroa has also been directed as a documentary because it is said that the spirit of Greece was saved by moving to France, because the decades that followed marked a very bloody civil war and then a right-wing authoritarian regime until the institution of the junta, and then a dictatorship, the junta. Until 1974, Greece was a political desert, and Castoriadis and the others would likely have been sought or exiled or tortured in that landscape. So they came to France and they left Greece December 1945 with nothing on them, with just a bag. And Castoriadis, when he came to the first night he came to Paris, he came in contact with his Trotskyist comrades and became a member of the Trotskyist party, only to become a heretic alongside Claude Lefort in the following months. Because what he had experienced in Greece persuaded him that the Soviet Union was not just a failed workers' party that had a bad leader, but otherwise, with a change of leadership, it could reform, like the Orthodox Trotskyist said. But he pointed out that there is a new exploitative class rising in Russia, bureaucracy, which proves that it's not a matter of the ownership of the means of production, but of the, how can I say, the management of the means of production and the management of society. So he began to question basic tenets of the Marxist theory, like the primacy of the economic sector over every other social aspect.
Why don't we take a very quick break to show some pictures of Castoriadis, just so people have a face to put to this
Yes, he's a very interesting face as well. You can never forget him.
Let's see. So we have Castoriadis here in his office in Paris.
Yes, where he also he also analyzed. He was a psychoanalyst until the end of his life.
Yeah.
And also a critic of Lacan. This is a very interesting aspect of his theory as well, his psychoanalytical theories, but we'll have the opportunity to discuss about that in later episodes.
One of the striking things that people miss is that, well, you know, he's bald. He has no hair, but in fact, no hair throughout his body. That's because at a very young age, he tried to commit suicide in response to corporal punishment at his school, and so he electrocuted himself in his bathtub. And he also experienced incredible amount of stress, psychological stress. Growing up, the loss of his mother, who was very ill when she contracted syphilis from Castoriadis' father, and he cared for his mother and was close to his mother for some time, and but the result of this, the physical impact of the suicide attempt and the psychological stress of years of living through turbulence were all factors that may have added up to what eventually killed his hair follicle system. So he had no hair over his entire body, and the joke goes that he's the most famous bald head in philosophy that you've never heard of. But he's not very well known in the English-speaking world. But hopefully, with more discussions and public consideration of some of the theory and the ideas and how they apply to the present, and that will begin to change.
Yes, and there are many reasons for that obscurity of Castoriadis, which also Francois Dos in his biography points that out. Because Castoriadis was highly esteemed by very well-known intellectuals like Octavio Paz, the Nobelist poet of Mexico. He was a very close friend of him. Edgar Morin, the French intellectual. François Lyotard was known to him, and they had also a disagreement. He had a famous disagreement with Jean-Paul Sartre, public disagreement. But all that did not lead to a fame like the ones enjoyed by Derrida or Foucault. There are many factors pointing about that. And one of them is that he's not a systematic philosopher, for example. But I think I would like just to say that, in my opinion, the content of Castoriadis' philosophy is too radical for it to be recognized like the one of Foucault or Derrida, which can lead to a disappointment with everything as well. Castoriadis points out at all times the responsibility of us creating our own history, and that alongside other radical thinkers has led him for long outside the academic institutions. In Greece, for example, Castoriadis during his lifetime was widely, disregarded by the left, the Greek left, which tried to obscure his ideas and denounce him as an agent of CIA and such funny stories. Because he left he deconstructed the Marxist narrative very thoroughly.
There's
the Greek
Stalinist
left, yes, of course. The Greek Stalinist left, and this is like one friend comments.
Yes, the author, Marcella Tovar Restrepo, in her book, Castoriadis, Foucault, and Autonomy, she points out that one of the reasons why Castoriadis is an obscure figure is because he didn't really try to situate his own thinking within the, what was happening philosophically at the time. Or he tried to play into academia. He was concerned with the revolutionary project and the revolutionary project of autonomy, and he wasn't out there, doing peer-reviewed papers in the same way that other intellectuals have been, or trying to establish himself in those same ways. So he was just doing something very different. Yes, there's also a significant influence in the US and in the UK around this time. In the US, he was in collaboration via Socialism and Barbarism with the Johnson Forest tendency, which was C.L.R. James, Grace Lee Boggs, Rhea Dunayevskaya, James Forrest, and there's an image in Dos's book of Grace Lee Boggs, very young Grace Lee Boggs, when she is known as Rhea Stone. I don't know if we can see her there. Hang on, there she is on the left here. But she was in Detroit. She died a few years ago, but she's an important U.S. political thinker. and collaborator with Castoriadis, particularly around the Facing Reality text, which sought to capture the disillusionment of the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956, which had a profound impact on Castoriadis, as well as many in the Trotskyist movement, and who were disillusioned by this and sought to move further left along with C.L.R. James. And but Castoriadis went on to write more about workers' councils and self-management with the Economics of a Self-Managed Society, a pamphlet, which was then published by another group in the UK, the Solidarity Group, which Castoriadis also, in the Socialism and Barbarism group, also were influential on, and Solidarity being one of the groups to first publish Castoriadis in English. The famous British neurologist Christopher Agamemnon Pallas, he discovered brainstem death and diagnosed it, and he was one of the first. He was the co-founder of the Solidarity Group, and the first to translate Castoriadis for a British English-speaking audience in collaboration with Castoriadis, and they went on to collaborate for many years after that. These collaborations, again, are not so well known today, but hopefully with more excavation, they'll become more easily visible. So why don't we talk about, I mean, we're going to, in due course, we're going to get to discussing the concept of autonomy, a key philosophical concept in Castoriadis's oeuvre. And we're going to talk about heteronomy and barbarism. But before doing that, or should we just jump right into it? I mean, there's before doing that, maybe we should say, we have our book. We've written our book on Castoriadis and Autonomy in the 21st Century. And so how did we arrive at that? We were each, at the time I was in the US, more than a decade ago. I had been influenced by largely Castoriadis's political economy. And at the time, and through the political and social writings that David Curtis had done translations of Castoriadis' work. Here's volume 1 of David's translations, and then a few years later, in 2008, the Greek uprising occurred, a massive uprising in response to the police murder of a young boy, Alexandros Grigoropoulos. And being in the US and having been familiar with Castoriadis' ideas, I was captured by what was happening by the revolt and uprising in Greece. And maybe you can say more about that, Alexandros and Nikos, and how that fits into your experience with Castoriadis.
Yes. If I may start where Nikos left that, and pass on to him the thread of the conversation. While I was growing up in Agrinio, in that city that we said, I met with Nikos through an anti-racist festival. And in 1997, Castoriadis died. And I remember Nikos coming and said that the body of Castoriadis is dead, meaning that his thought is still alive. So we decided, I was a student then, but Nikos was older, we decided to make the first political memorial for Castoriadis the next month after his death in Agrinio, which was the first in Greece. And then we discussed his ideas more thoroughly, which were also always in discussion among the anarchists of Agrinio, and came in contact with Yannis Tamtakos, as I said, and other Castoriadis comrades and students. And when the 20th first century began with the alter globalization or anti-globalization movement, both me and Nikos participated in the demonstrations in Prague 2000 and Genoa 2001. And then there we saw the need for a revision of the traditional political revolutionary project and form of organization and collectivity. And there we started moving from the anti-Marxist critique, the anti-Marxist side, the critique of Marxism of Castoriadis, which had inspired us till then, to his project of autonomy, which defines more positively institutions and structures that would promote human liberation. And so Castoriadis informed us already from 2001 when we decided to publish a journal named Contact in Agrinio, in that city, which became like how can I say, a print space for philosophical discussion and criticism, not only of Marxism, but also of traditional anarchism and of traditional forms of organization. Νίκο, η ερώτηση είναι πώς μας επηρέασε ο Καστοριάδης μέχρι το Δεκέμβρη του 8.
Πολύ ωραία. Συνεχίσω δηλαδή από εκεί που είχα σταματήσει, γιατί ήθελα να πω ότι ακολουθήσαμε κατά κάποιο τρόπο την πορεία του Καστοριάδη, δηλαδή κριτική στον μαρξισμό και σκέψεις για το τι άλλο πέρα από αυτό. Άμα δεχτούμε ότι παγκοσμίως αυτό που καθόρισε την ιδέα για την αλλαγή της κοινωνίας, για το ριζικό μετασχηματισμό της, ήταν ο μαρξισμός, έτσι. Και εμείς σαν αναρχικοί τότε χρησιμοποιήσαμε τη σκέψη του Καστοριάδη, όπως είπα πριν, για να ανταπεξέλθουμε απέναντι στο κομμουνιστικό και το σοσιαλιστικό κίνημα. Γίνεται λοιπόν αυτή η ρήξη. Να πω μάλιστα κάτι που είπαμε και την άλλη φορά, ας το πούμε και τώρα, ότι όταν πέθανε ο μέντορας του Καστοριάδη, ο Άγης Τίνας, ο Σπύρος Πρίστης, στην κηδεία του, στην Κέρκυρα, υπήρχαν δύο στεφάνια, ένα από εδώ και ένα από εκεί στον νεκρό, όπου το ένα ήταν του Καστοριάδη, το οποίο έγραφε στον Ιωνί πατέρα μου, και το άλλο της Ένωσης Αναρχικών. Και στη συνέχεια, λοιπόν, και μόλις όπως είπε και ο Αλέξανδρος, ναι.
Να κάνουμε. Let's translate while. Nikos is saying that in a way we followed, and their generation, which was the older guys from me, they followed Castoriadis' trajectory from the criticism of Marxism, moving to the questions what comes beyond that. What other revolutionary prospects are there? How else can we discuss that? And as an anarchist as anarchists, they were also already familiar with Castoriadis' ideas through that radical criticism of Marxism, because it's very important to point out that Castoriadis said we came to the moment that we have to decide between the remaining Marxists or remaining revolutionaries. He did not make, how can I say, a conservative critique of Marxism, as it was very usual in France at that point. So Nikos says that when Spiro Agistinas died in Corfu, there were two memorial rims in his funeral. The one from Castoriadis, with the inscription to my political father, and the other was from the Anarchist Union of Agrinio, from this group in Agrinio that inside the anarchist movement were more involved with Castoriadis' ideas. Και μετά το 2000, Νίκο.
Ήδη εντωμεταξύ από τη δεκαετία του 90, όταν γνώρισα κιόλας εσένα, Αλέξανδρε, που ήσουν μαθητής τότε, αρχίζουμε να σκεφτόμαστε, εγώ δηλαδή αρχίζω να σκέφτομαι ότι ό,τι είχαμε να πούμε για την Επανάσταση το είπαμε. Δεν έχουμε κάτι άλλο να ψάξουμε να βρούμε, να δούμε τον μαρξισμό από άλλη πλευρά ή από άλλη, τον αναρχισμό ή τι είπε ο Μπακούνιν. Είχαν υποθεί όλα. Το μόνο το οποίο μας έδινε μια προοπτική για μια πολιτική σκέψη, η οποία θα μπορούσε να μας διατηρήσει ζωντανή μέσα μας τη φλόγα για την αλλαγή της κοινωνίας. Αρχίζαμε να καταλαβαίνουμε ήδη από τη δεκαετία του 90 και λίγο πριν πεθάνει ο Καστοριάδης, ότι είναι ο μόνος τρόπος να δημιουργήσουμε, να αποκτήσουμε τέλος πάντων μια αξίωση για αυτή τη ριζική αλλαγή της κοινωνίας. Ήταν ο μόνος τρόπος οι ιδέες του Καστοριάδη, η πολιτική πρόταση του Καστοριάδη. Αρχίζαμε να καταλαβαίνουμε αυτό ήδη από τη δεκαετία του 90.
Nikos said that the early 90s, he had begun to understand that the only way to talk seriously about social transformation and give a serious perspective to the revolutionary project was to the orientation of Castoriadis' ideas and through the political project of autonomy that he pointed out.
Και ήδη, όπως έλεγε και ο Αλέξανδρος πριν, καταλαβαίνουμε ότι υπάρχει υλικό, υπάρχει ψωμί που λέμε στην Ελλάδα στη σκέψη του Καστοριάδη. Δηλαδή, καταλαβαίνουμε ότι μόνο έτσι μπορούμε να δημιουργήσουμε μια σύγχρονη πολιτική πρόταση. Με την ιδέα για το πρόταγμα της αυτονομίας, έτσι όπως το παρουσιάζει ο Καστοριάδης, και την άμεση δημοκρατία. Έτσι, από τις αρχές του 2000, με τον Αλέξανδρο και με άλλους, αρχίζουμε να δημιουργούμε ένα μικρό ρεύμα κατά κάποιο τρόπο, το οποίο μιλάει στην Ελλάδα για την πρόταση, για την πολιτική πρόταση της άμεσης δημοκρατίας. Για την αλλαγή, δηλαδή, για τη ριζική αλλαγή, την πολιτική και την κοινωνική, και με συγκεκριμένο πολιτικό καθεστώς, όπως το έλεγε κάποτε και ο Καστοριάδης, πρέπει να το δούμε ως καθεστώς, ως πολιτιακό σύστημα, δηλαδή, την άμεση δημοκρατία. Από τότε, λοιπόν, από τις αρχές του 2000, αρχίζουμε να μπαίνουμε σε αυτό το trip.
He says that from the beginning of 2000, like I said also, we started forming our ideas around the project of autonomy and around the idea of direct democracy, not only as a means of organization, but as a political regime, a central political institution for the radical social transformation of society. And since the beginning of 2000, we have started discussing and how can I say, experimenting in our political activity with Castoriadis' ideas by posing the project of autonomy and direct democracy as a central political issue of social movements and criticizing the traditional forms of organization, the closed hierarchical party or syndicate. And I would like to continue that this has also informed our involvement with other social movements, because of course we were not the only ones that had been influenced by the set of ideas proposed by and discussed by Castoriadis. Also, it's not just a doctrine, it's not at all a doctrine. Castoriadis is not like a figure like Marx that provided a set of rules, but rather an opening to the wider project of autonomy, which in various historical times has emerged in various forms of theoretical discussions, philosophical ideas, and social forms of organizations. So there is a broader tradition of thought, but not a stricter philosophical tradition like a school where we can place Castoriadis. You can find his name outside any specific. He's not a post-constructivist, he's not a post-structuralist, he's not a phenomenologist. He was a Marxist, but became a radical critic of Marxism.
He's also not a postmodernist.
He's not a postmodernist, of course, and that's why he's not so popular. but in any way, he is a prominent thinker of the greater democratic tradition and, how can I say, current of autonomy and human liberation, like other prominent political thinkers. So he is not an isolated persona. He's not something like Heidegger. And he's not also, and neither is he the head of a school. He's, as you described it, a prominent theorist, but who remained a political activist through his life. And it was that political activity of his that inspired us initially in order to be able to, how can I say, act in our social historical environment.
So there's so much there, and I think there's a lot we can talk about, including the critique of Marxism. I think at some point in a future episode, we'll have to talk more about that, because his engagement with Marxism is really interesting. I personally learned a lot from it over the years, and revisit it from time to time. And so we'll revisit this in a future episode, I think, his critique of Marxism. But why don't we move on to a discussion more explicitly around the concept of autonomy and heteronomy and barbarism? Let's just start off first with autonomy. We'll just etymologically, the word auto is, the self, and nomos is law. So the act of creating one's own law for the practice of self-governance, we could say, very generally speaking. But Castoriadis means much more than this. I mean, it's typically, when we use the term colloquially in everyday English, and we speak of autonomy, we have some, I think, some assumption deep down that we're talking about, individual rights, some perspective of, I have a right to my own property. I have a right to, my personal possessions, or even a right to my own body. But Castoriadis means something by autonomy, individual autonomy and social autonomy. And so why don't we talk a bit more about that? Go on and say more about autonomy, and let's just get into it.
Well, yes, autonomy is a word that is, as you said, it means positing your own law and creating your own law. However, it is the term, what do we define by law? And the word autonomy, as discussed by Castoriadis, the law is not just a penal institution or something that has to do with imposing judgment, but is society creating its own institutions, society self-creating its own forms of governance, but also its own significances and norms and way of interpreting reality. In that way, positing our own law means that society acknowledges the fact that its dominant significations, institutions, and norms are not coming from some metaphysical source, from the laws of history, for example, or from God, or from the laws of the market, or from some external to society factor, but are creations of society itself. Castoriadis points out that this happens every time. Every society creates its own self by positing its own meanings upon the world. But the persistence of social inequality, social authority, obscure these facts from the broader population. So we have this sanctification of authority by positing as a truth that the law is God-given, or nature given, or historically given by some and uncontrollable by the individuals. Castoriadis points out that this is heteronomy, being defied by the law posed by another, by the state, by something external from you. And so he catches up with the meaning of autonomy, which, Chris, you are right, has an individualistic origin, because in the history of philosophical modernity, autonomy is a Kantian concept which refers to the self-determination of the individual. And Castoriadis expands this notion by pointing out that the individual, every time, each person is an individual deeply informed by society. That Castoriadis points out that we are not born adult individuals with a logical, rational mind, but we are born as infants that have to be socialized in society. So individual autonomy presupposes social autonomy, and social autonomy presupposes a society which is organized in basis of equality and self-government. So autonomy is at first a project, something to be realized that we're not fully there, but on the other hand is an exception in the historical formations of human societies, because it points out to a society which is radically democratic, a society of free and equal individuals. And the question posed by Castoriadis is what possibilities and what are the social historical preconditions for an autonomous society? But in order to understand that, it's good to begin by the autonomous individual and the subject, and just see that Castoriadis says that an autonomous individual or subject is one that knows itself to be justified in concluding, this I know is truth, and this I know is my desire, without being over-controlled by its passions or desires. But this presupposes a deep education, because autonomy presupposes that we respect the others as equal and autonomous. That's a broad line which we can delve into and analyze the main elements, I think. If I may continue, just to keep the historical biographical trend, autonomy is an idea that first presents itself in the writings of Castoriadis during his Marxist period in Socialisme ou Barbarie, which means the self-management of the workers. Like we said, the self-organizations of the workers, that the workers will self-organize themselves and not becomes instrument of a ruling party like it happened in the Soviet Union. So autonomy for Castoriadis at that point was the true content of socialism in the dilemma Socialisme ou Barbarie. Later on, he began to criticize the historical determinism and economical determinism of Marxism, which supposed that society is overdetermined by a blind economical and historical are beyond human control. And he began to expand the concept of autonomy beyond just the socialist project. He began to search for other forms of autonomy, going back to the idea that an autonomous society is the only society that is capable of questioning its own motives in a clear and deliberative way.
Και να δούμε πώς μπαίνουμε πλέον στον 21ο αιώνα με τη σκέψη του Καστοριάδη.
What was that, Alexei?
Nikos said that you want us to see how we enter the 21st century with the concept of Castoriadis autonomy?
Yes, that sounds good. Just very quickly, just point out a few terms that were used in this discussion. Social imaginary significations, concepts like this, which we've not had a chance to explain, which are the ways that Castoriadis proposed that societies make meanings, creating symbols and networks of symbols to create meanings. And he uses language as an example. So Alexandros talked about how an individual is informed by broader society more generally when they come up. They're just not born into this world able to speak and think with all the categories and concepts and meanings and structures, grammatical and thought structures that we evolve and grow into and develop, but that we learn this from the language and the society that's evolved over time, and that is an active, ongoing process. And so, on the one hand, social imaginary significations means that, or is that, and then the concept of heteronomy. It's important to point out that social imaginary significations can support heteronymous modes of being and autonomous modes of being. And by that I mean social imaginary significations, these networks of symbols and meanings, can support self-reflective, self-critical, limiting, directly democratic, collective forms of self-governance on the one hand, but social imaginary significations are also networks and meanings that can support societies and individuals' beliefs in the creation of society by an external being or force, whether that be the natural laws of capitalism or capital, human evolution, genetics, a god, or deity. So for example, Castoriadis gives religion as another example of heteronymous mode of being, where a deity or deities is perceived to be the external force that's responsible for the creation of everything. So with those, go ahead.
No, just a parenthesis there, because you discussed the religion. God is one of the best examples of what a social imaginary signification is. God is not a physical being. He is an imaginary being, but as a signification, as a meaning, he informs and determines the whole structure of a theocratical society. For example, medieval Europe. The idea of God is the basic social imaginary signification that functions as a justification of all forms of power and authority and social inequality. In capitalism, for example, that imaginary central signification is rational growth and capital expansion.
Yes. Okay, so I think Nikos raised the issue of expanding this concept of autonomy into 21st century. So.
Νίκο, για την ιδέα της αυτονομίας στον 21ο αιώνα.
Αυτό ακριβώς όπως έλεγε και ο Κρίς, βλέπουμε λοιπόν, τελειώνοντας ο 20ος αιώνας και μπαίνοντας στον 21ο, βλέπουμε ότι ναι, ο Καστοριάδης, το νιώθουμε αυτό και μεγαλώνοντας πολιτικά οι ίδιοι, βλέπουμε ότι ο Καστοριάδης είναι ένας φιλόσοφος του 21ου αιώνα, ο τελευταίος κατά κάποιο τρόπο φιλόσοφος του 21ου αιώνα, και έρχεται να γίνει ο πρώτος του 21ου αιώνα, ο οποίος είναι και ο μοναδικός όπου αποδομεί, κάνει την κριτική του στο μαρξισμό και όχι μόνο, αλλά συνολικά στον ντετερμινισμό στη φιλοσοφία. Δεν αποδέχεται όμως το υπάρχον, αλλά σκέφτεται τη ριζική ανατροπή του, το ριζικό μετασχηματισμό του και ερχόμαστε στον 21ο αιώνα και βλέπουμε ότι οι ιδέες του εξηγούν αυτομάτως, με έναν αυτόματο τρόπο, αυτό που συμβαίνει, τις νέες εξεγέρσεις, τις νέες τάσεις, τις κοινωνικές παγκοσμίως, που την υποχώρηση της αυθεντίας. Και βρίσκουμε τρία σημεία πολύ σημαντικά στον 21ο αιώνα, τα οποία εμφανίζονται, μας έρχονται από παντού, εμφανίζονται, αποκαλύπτονται κατά κάποιο τρόπο, τα οποία έχουν να κάνουν με τρία σημαντικά σημεία που μας έχει εντοπίσει ο Καστοριάδης από πολύ νωρίς. Ένα, τη θέση του ατόμου στην κοινωνία, την αλλαγή της θέσης του ατόμου στην κοινωνία και με όσα αυτό κουβαλάει, την αλλαγή, την διάρκεια...
Yes, Nico, let's translate before you get in the 3 points. Nikos said that Castoriadis' idea and criticism of traditional political organization, but also of traditional political determinism, like the ones in Marxism, which proposed that history would gestate another society in a deterministic way. His critique made him the last political thinker of the 20th century and the first political thinker of the 21st century, because his concepts and ideas can be very helpful in explaining the social historical phenomena of the 21st century, like the questioning of authority, the crisis of representation, the crisis of traditional forms of organization. And he likes to point out that Castoriadis' ideas are very helpful to explain 3 major points of transformation that we see in the 21st century. Τώρα πες τα 3 σημεία, Νίκος.
Αυτά τα 3 σημεία, λοιπόν, είναι ένα, η θέση του ατόμου στην κοινωνία, η οποία πλέον διαπιστώνουμε ότι όχι απλώς έχει αλλάξει, αλλά μεταφέρει μαζί της αυτή η αλλαγή πράγματα συγκλονιστικά για τον άνθρωπο, αυτή η αλλαγή της θέσης του ατόμου.
The transformation of the position of the individual within society and the crisis of identity that accompanies it, which transformation of individual's position brings new perspectives and new problems.
Αυτό, το πρώτο, μας αφήνει να καταλάβουμε ότι αλλάζει μαζί με την αλλαγή της θέσης του ατόμου, αλλάζει και η ίδια η συλλογικότητα και αυτό συμβαίνει παγκοσμίως, σε όλη την ανθρωπότητα.
Through this transformation of the individual's position in society, there's also the transformation of the forms of collectivities that the individual participate in, and this is something that's happening worldwide. The traditional forms of collectivity are being under question.
Και όπως μας λέει ο Καστοριάδης ήδη λίγο πριν πεθάνει, το 1997 δηλαδή, το 1997, όπου μας λέει ότι έχουν διαλυθεί, έχουν χαθεί, έχουν εξαφανιστεί κάποιες θεσμισμένες λειτουργίες οι οποίες στο παρελθόν κατά κάποιον τρόπο αναπαρήγαγαν ή εξέφραζαν το πρόταγμα της κοινωνικής και της ατομικής αυτονομίας. Έχουμε δηλαδή σήμερα, και το βλέπουμε αυτό κατευθείαν στον 21ο αιώνα, ότι δεν υπάρχει πλέον τίποτα παραδοσιακό πολιτικό το οποίο να εκφράσει κάτι γύρω από την αλλαγή της κοινωνίας, είτε συνδικαλισμός είναι αυτό, είτε πολιτική οργάνωση, είτε κόμμα. Χάνονται αυτές οι θεσμισμένες λειτουργίες, λοιπόν. Αυτό είναι το δεύτερο.
In his late writings pointed out that some instituted functions that used to express the transformative, like some political parties or the syndicates, have lost their significance and their meanings. And with the dawn of the 21st century, we experienced this loss of meaning of the traditional expression, instituted functions that expressed some aspects of the radical project or some, how can I say, gains that the workers and revolutionary movement had made during their struggles.
Και το τρίτο σημείο, το οποίο περιέχει και τα δύο πρώτα, είναι οι νέες σημασίες και νέα νοήματα που εμφανίζονται σε όλα τα σημεία του ορίζοντα του πλανήτη και έχουν να κάνουν αυτά και με τα δύο πρώτα, και με τη θέση του ατόμου και με τη νέα συλλογικότητα. Έχουμε νέες κοινωνικές δικτυώσεις δηλαδή, οι οποίες έχουν πιο πολύ σχέση με το κοινωνικό πράτην, την αμεσότητα, και όχι την υπόσχεση για μια άλλη κοινωνία.
And the point is the rise and emergence of new significations that seem to be emerging in social movements worldwide. And these new significations bring with come forms of social networking and social organization and political and global networking that are inspired by social doing and social transformation here and now, and not by evolutionary promise or a messianic project like the traditional movements.
Έτσι, με την σκέψη του Καστοριάδη, αρχίζουμε να αναγνωρίζουμε τους δρόμους της αυτονομίας στον 21ο αιώνα.
So Castoriadis' theoretical concepts are very useful in order to understand the new roads that open up to the project of autonomy in the 21st century through a series of social movements and insurrections. And I would like to point out that such a form of social uprising was the December riots in 2008, which led to us meeting Chris, which was something, a historical event that nobody expected, because it was an uprising of a wide range of Greek society, and not just of the excluded people, against police brutality and against state authority for a month throughout Greece.
Yes, I mean, it included children and parents and grandparents and migrants and refugees, students, workers.
Yes, actually, it was led by students in high school protesting the murder of their co-student Alexandros because he was just king in Exarchia, the highly, how can I say, documented place in Athens. And this uprising was led by students expressing their, how can I say, indignation with authority by sieging the police stations with oranges and things like that. But what was important in that moment, historical event, is that a new sense of public space emerged, and a new, how can I say, forms of collectivity emerged that put and explicitly the question of autonomy, of social autonomy, and how to achieve that, and how to move beyond the oligarchy that we live, and which was led, of course, to the Occupy movement in 2011.
Yes, I think those that kicked off a series of movements that really recognized, naturally, recognized might be too strong of a word, but took advantage of public space in ways that spanned months and even years during this period. From that 2008 Greek uprising to the Squares movement to Occupy, to the M15 movement in Spain, to the Arab Spring. These movements, there's several common denominators, even if on the face of it, there may have been some different issues, but the use of public space and deliberation and sharing a common experience in public space was something that was common among them, and that's the thread that we try to pick up in our book and interpret. What's interesting is we also draw this connection to the the ancient experience of Athenian autonomy and the creation of a public space and time, separate from a religious space and time in ancient Athens, where that space and time was used for reflective deliberative democracy, for theater and tragedy, all vehicles for self-reflection, by no means perfect, in many ways imperfect, and in many ways not things, with characteristics that we would not want to replicate today. But the use of space and time for civic reflection and self-governance as the explicit acknowledgement that law is rendered through a social process and a social deliberation. That's a key feature that I think is important, that we recognized, we saw in the early 21st century. That is consistent, and so yeah, I find it fascinating. But in terms of some of
one of the main lessons of Castoriadis' approach to society and history is the lesson that praxis, the political act of autonomy, is more important than theory, because praxis is the act of collectively transforming the world, and thus, through transforming our social world, we also transform the data that theory uses. So Castoriadis' radical turn consists also in asserting the primacy of practical reason over theoretical reason. So that's why he's very useful in questioning the dominant significations, and does not provide a blueprint like other ideologies, or a recipe, a model for social change. He poses a basic question that we self-create as a society, our own history, and we cannot predetermine what lies ahead if we do not act consciously on it. I think that is a basic tenet of ancient democracy as well, the lack of predetermination and the sense of social responsibility towards the future, but which demands and presupposes the equality of citizens, and of course the equality of participation in institutions of power, something that we lack today.
And in terms of that, something that we lack today, it's interesting because in the Western imaginary, and in that complements predominant Western ideologies and chauvinism, such as Fukuyama's The End of History and the Liberal Order coming to define the world, markets, and representative democracies, or the idea that the clash of civilizations idea that the West is the only place capable of attaining enlightenment. These Western conceptions of the world, the social imaginaries, extrapolate and abstract way the conception of direct democracy from the ancient experience, while using that and exploiting the social imaginary of ancient Greece to support the Western superiority, and it's the democratic systems that characterize the U.S. and the parliamentary system in the U.K. and many Western European countries, and throughout the Anglosphere, generally, are forms of democracy that Castoriadis critiqued as liberal oligarchies, and they're formed this basis that he critiqued Plato for in the book of Castoriadis' dialogue with Plato. Plato's suggestion that experts need to tell the common person what's best for them, and the politician, the thing that's extrapolated from that in the Western social imaginary, is the politicians know what's best. That politics are a technical exercise, far too complicated for the common person, for the citizen, for the public, and they need to elect a technical representative to discuss, deliberate, debate, and vote on something that's far removed from their life. Whereas the directly democratic experience suggests, well, politics aren't really anything that's beyond the common wisdom and the common social experience. Yes, you have technical matters, you have technical advisors, they help inform and help make decisions, but politics is not something that should be removed from our everyday lives and experiences. So the notion of autonomy, in its critique, I think is very interesting as well.
Exactly, and that is Castoriadis critique the concept of political science. Pointed out that also in ancient democracy, but also in the newer, the modern forms of democratic movements, politics is not a science. Politics is a matter of opinion and a matter of socially and collectively informing the institutions and the decisions that we make as a society. If we treat politics as a science under the paradigm of the natural sciences, then we treat human society as something that is externally controlled. And of course, this opens up a huge array of inequalities by subjugating society to the experts, as we say. Castoriadis pointed out that one of the basic characteristics of modern capitalism is the division between experts and workers, or the division between directors and executants. And but also, in order to make politically informed decisions as a society, there also has to be an actually informed society on political matters. So one of the difference between ancient democratic societies and modern liberal democracies is the flow of information. Whereas in our societies, where society is excluded from access to the information, which remains isolated to the closed offices of political authority and power. Whereas in ancient democracy and other forms of democratic movements, like the commune, or like the early Soviets, or like the workers' council, the flow of information was coming from society to the institutions. Everybody was educated in order to be informed about the basic political decisions that determines our collective life. This is very important in an age of misinformation and in an age where access to information is debated. I think we should point out we're not speaking about a society of individuals running wild and amok in the forests, but we're speaking about a deliberative society which understands that the decisions that are politically, the political decisions are something that reflects changes to everyone's lives, and everyone should have a saying in that. That is a practical concept of autonomy, for example. An autonomous individual is the one that can make critical and deliberative decisions with full responsibility among other autonomous individuals. So this presupposes social equality, and this presupposes social freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of action. And these simple ideas that are realized in democratic forms of governing have direct philosophical and existential, I would say, implications. Do we believe that human individuals are responsible for their actions, or do we believe that they are just puppets in how can I say, invisible godlike powers?
I think Nikos may want to jump in here, but just very quickly, I think what we've done and what we intend to do, but I think we've done it very casually and implicitly, is we've moved from the discussion of autonomy and transitioned into discussion of heteronomy very generally, in talking about the lack of information flows, and how people perceive themselves in relation to society, and if they perceive themselves as decision makers or order takers. And so I'm just wondering, do we want to just move into heteronomy at this point and discuss it more explicitly, or is there more to say around this?
It is, you're right, Chris. However, I think that this moving back and forth is inevitable, because we can understand autonomy if we stress the difference with what we're experiencing today. As we can understand democracy if we point out what is liberal oligarchy as well. Because you are right, the regimes of today are, as Castoriadis would say, are regimes of deception. Whereas in ancient times, even the oligarchical regimes named themselves as they were, an empire, for example. In our modern times, the regimes mask themselves between words like republics, democracy, etc. For example, republic is the USA, and republic is also Iran. So.
Μπορώ να πω.
Ναι.
Ίσως θα πρέπει να δεχτούμε ότι από την εποχή όπου συμβαίνει η πρώτη ρήξη, το πρώτο ρήγμα των ολίγων με τους πολλούς, δηλαδή στην αρχαία Αθηναϊκή Δημοκρατία, από τότε όλη η ιστορία γύρω από την πολιτική στην ανθρωπότητα είναι μεταξύ ετερονομίας και αυτονομίας. Δηλαδή τη συμμετοχή των πολλών στην εξουσία και τη συμμετοχή των λίγων στην εξουσία.
Nikos says that even since the emergence of autonomy in ancient Mediterranean and the emergence of politics alongside democracy and philosophy, the big questions of politics has always been the struggle between autonomy and the participations of the many in governance, and heteronomy and the authority of the few.
Σε αυτή την περίπτωση, βέβαια, την μεγάλη περίπτωση ιστορική, η ετερονομία είναι αυτή που κερδίζει. Σε κάθε περίπτωση.
In the majority of history, heteronomy wins this struggle.
Ωστόσο, αυτό πέρασε μια μεγάλη περίοδος, αυτή για την οποία μιλάγαμε πριν, της κυριαρχίας του ντετερμινισμού και του μαρξισμού στην πολιτική, όπου στην πραγματικότητα αφαίρεσε την πολιτική από την ιδέα για την αλλαγή της κοινωνίας. Με την έννοια, την καστοριαδική και τέλος πάντων, τη δημοκρατική έννοια, ότι η πολιτική δεν είναι τίποτε άλλο παρά η συμμετοχή στην εξουσία για τη διακυβέρνηση της πόλης.
And he said that one of the tragedies of the Marxist and deterministic tradition in the 20th century is that it took politics out of the project of the social transformation. It erased politics by erasing internal democracy, the Communist Party, and thus created a void because Nikos refers to politics in the sense that Castoriadis refers as the collective and deliberative participation in the institutions of governments for reasons of social transformation. Νίκο.
Λέει ο Καστοριάδης, αυτονομία σημαίνει δίνουμε σε εμάς τους νόμους μας και τους θεσμούς μας, ξέροντας ότι εμείς τους δημιουργούμε, ξέροντας ότι εμείς τους κατασκευάζουμε.
Castoriadis said that autonomy means that we give ourselves our laws and our institutions by deliberately acknowledging that we create them and that we construct them as a society, as a social imaginary, not as an assembly of individuals.
Όταν ο νόμος έρχεται από θεσμούς έξω από εμάς, τότε πλέον έχουμε την heteronomia και αυτό διατρέχει όλες τις ιδεολογίες στην πραγματικότητα του διαφωτισμού, συμπεριλαμβανομένης και αυτής των αναρχικών, που με την άρνηση του πολιτικού και της εξουσίας, κατ' επέκταση, οδηγείται έξω από την πολιτική στην πραγματικότητα.
And he says that if we face the law or accept the law as something that externally be imposed to us, then we have a society of alienation and an imaginary of heteronomy. And this is also something that contaminated the movements and the currents of enlightenment, and was carried in the Marxist movement, but also the Anarchist movement, when the Anarchists obscured and denounced the question of power and institutions of decision-making altogether.
If I could just interject very, very quickly, the relationship between alienation and heteronomy is one that I find very interesting, because in the Marxist framework, alienation begins at the point of production, the extraction of labor to produce something, a product that is outside your own self and objectives. So you're producing something for the objectives of the capitalist. You're having your surplus labor extracted from you to produce something for the objectives of the other person who owns your labor, the capitalist. And in what I find interesting about the relationship between alienation and the social historical that Nikos just mentioned, is that alienation in this sense is the heteronomous institutions being a reproducing a network of meanings, social imaginary significations that are not really serving our own objectives. So alienation in this sense is much deeper and broader. It has to do with everything about society rather than the things that are floating around, the commodities that we see in the supermarket or online. It has to do with literally the institutions, laws, social relations. Anyways, I find that very interesting, and Nikos mentioned it. Made me perk up.
If I can comment on that, alienation that you very rightly pointed out, Chris, the Marxist tradition has with the economical and productive social relationships. The work is alienated from the product of his labor. However, there is also another individualistic sense of alienation that comes with existentialism, Kierkegaard, Heidegger, and all these guys, that was the alienation of the individual, of the subject, of the person, towards his social and historical surroundings. The fact that he cannot identify with himself. If we use Castoriadis' concept, we can understand why both definitions are partially correct and at large miss the point. Because Castoriadis points out that we are not alienated towards ourselves, but towards the institutions of society, the meaning of life that society produces us with. Our identity, our social identity, is a social signification. So when we feel existentially alienated, that's because we're excluded from the decisions and the participations in the institutions that define our lives. And this is what happens also in terms of production, but is not, how can I say, closed there. It happens more directly in the sense of social hierarchies, social norms, and social authority that alienate us from access to the institutions that define our lives, whether that is the state or our position in the social ladder. So Castoriadis broadens this concept of alienation, but also points out that in an autonomous society, alienation would not be an existential problem. So he does not carry on this, how can I say, pessimistic seed of 20th century existentialism that says that you are damned to be cursed as a human to live in alienation. Castoriadis says that it is the dominant significations of society that alienate us because they are the significations of inequality, exploitation, and of course, reproduce alienation. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes. I interrupted Nico so that we could so I interrupted Nico so that we could talk a bit about that. But yeah, please continue, Nikos.
Nico, έχεις να πεις?
Αυτό που ήθελα να πω ήταν ότι αυτές ακριβώς που έλεγα πριν, τα τρία σημεία και αυτό που βλέπουμε στον 21ο αιώνα, με αυτές τις αλλαγές με βάση τη σκέψη του, τα τρία σημεία από τη σκέψη, παίρνοντας δηλαδή τα τρία σημεία από τη σκέψη του Καστοριάδη, βλέπουμε τις αλλαγές που συμβαίνουν στην ανθρωπότητα και στις κοινωνίες στον 21ο αιώνα. Δηλαδή την αλλαγή του θέσης του ατόμου, την κατάρρευση του παραδοσιακού, την κατάρρευση των παλιών σημασιών και τη δημιουργία καινούριων, και τα βλέπουμε αυτά να εμφανίζονται, να μας αποκαλύπτονται σε κινήσεις κοινωνικές που δημιουργούνται από τα κάτω, όπως είπα πριν, και έχουν να κάνουν με το πράτην, με την καθημερινότητα δηλαδή. Είτε αυτό έχει να κάνει με τη γνώση και με τη μεταφορά της γνώσης, με την εκπαίδευση δηλαδή, που είναι πολύ σημαντικό, αλλά και με την ίδια την παραγωγή.
Nikos said we see these 3 points that he pointed out: the transformation of the individual's position and the identity crisis, the transformation of the forms of collectivity and social relationship, and the collapse of old significations, all traditional authorities and representations, and the emergence of new significations. We see them not only theoretically but practically in the 20th century in forms of grassroots social movements and cooperatives that emerge in in almost all domains of social life, in education, for example, but also in production.
Και το παράδοξο εδώ είναι ότι η παραδεταμένη σκέψη της αριστεράς και στον 21ο αιώνα, που σε κάποια σημεία κυριαρχεί και αυτή, εξηγεί αυτά τα φαινόμενα ως οικονομικά φαινόμενα, ως οικονομικά εγχειρήματα. Εδώ έχουμε πάλι απόδραση της πολιτικής. Ενώ πρόκειται για καθαρά πολιτικές κοινωνικές τάσεις που εμφανίζονται παγκοσμίως, πέρα από τον οικονομισμό, γιατί αντιμάχονται τον οικονομισμό, η αριστερή σκέψη, οι άνθρωποι δηλαδή που φέρουν την αριστερή σκέψη ως παράταση μέσα στον 21ο αιώνα, τα εξηγούν ως οικονομικά εγχειρήματα και πολλές φορές μέσα από αυτή την προσέγγιση θάβονται τα ίδια τα εγχειρήματα, γιατί πρόκειται για πολύ ευαίσθητες συνδέσεις, αλυσίδες, οικοσυστήματα κατά κάποιο τρόπο σε αυτή τη νέα πολιτική κίνηση.
And even in the fields of production, we see many, but also fragmented and widespread collectivities that run cooperatively and in a grassroots networking process that cannot be defined by economic terms because they move beyond economies and are inspired by different significations like solidarity, mutuality, and all this. But Nikos points out that there is a failure of the left thought in the 20th century, which carries on as an extension of the 20th century, in the 21st century, that tries to explain these phenomena in economic terms, and thus fails to interpret them in the correct manner because they're most of all and primarily political movements. A movement that posit the question of how to govern our lives.
Και να φέρω ένα παράδειγμα, τελειώνω με αυτό, τον Αντρέ Μανσέ στη Λατινική Αμερική, ο οποίος, αν το λέω σωστά δεν θυμάμαι, ο οποίος μιλάει για την οικονομία της απελευθέρωσης, περιγράφοντας αυτά τα εγχειρήματα. Λες και υπάρχει ποτέ περίπτωση η οικονομία, η δίθεν επιστήμη, η αριθμητική δηλαδή, να απελευθερώσει μια κοινωνία. Είναι αδιανόητο, όπως έλεγε και ο Καστοριάδης, για αυτά γενικώς. Για αυτές τις ιδέες.
As an example of leftist interpretation, Nikos refers to André Mancé, which spoke about an economy of liberation, a liberative economy. But we know that the economy as an independent institution cannot save any society, but to continue to supplement Nikos is saying, economy should be subjugated to other social needs and other social institutions like politics, education, and that. We cannot achieve human liberation just through economic terms, like the Marxist narrative pointed out.
Και να κλείσω με κάτι ακόμα. Και γι' αυτό κάνουμε πάρα πολύ καλά που γράψαμε αυτό το βιβλίο με τον Κρίς και με τον Αλέξανδρο, γιατί ακριβώς επανατοποθετεί την πολιτική στα πράγματα, στα παγκόσμια πράγματα, και μας δίνει τη δυνατότητα, έστω στο ελάχιστο, να δημιουργήσουμε προϋποθέσεις για να ανοίξει ο χώρος από πλευράς της σκέψης και των ιδεών, να ανοίξει ο χώρος, να ανοίξουμε χώρο, να αφήσουμε χώρο δηλαδή σε αυτές τις νέες κινήσεις και όχι να τις δώσουμε εμείς τον τρόπο που θα κινηθούν. Αυτό νομίζω χρειάζεται και τίποτα άλλο, γιατί εμπεριέχουν τις νέες σημασίες για τις οποίες μίλαγε ο Καστοριάδης ήδη από το 1975. Αυτές οι νέες κινήσεις. Εγώ αυτό πιστεύω.
To close his argument, Nikos says that he thinks that our book has this aspiration to open up a space of political discourse by placing again politics in the center of the project of social transformation, and opening up a space of public discourse and public dialogue, and also in theory, in order to let these new social significations that are embodied in the new horizontal direct democratical social movements be expressed, and not in order to tell people what to do. We want our book is an effort to start a dialogue with those movements that express those ideas and concepts that are also found in Castoriadis' philosophical and political works. So, and also our podcast is a form of opening up this dialogue. And because I just want to mention, just in reference, that like Theodoros Papadopoulos points out in his comment, David Ames Curtis, who was a friend of Castoriadis and the best his translator in English. His translations, David Curtis, are very accurate, pivotal, And I think that a very, how can I say, important contribution to this dialogue. And I think that in next episodes, in following episodes, we will have the opportunity to discuss with David as well and other people that have been involved with Castoriadis' life and thought.
Yes, moving forward, we have plans for interviews to have many exciting guests on, and once we establish ourselves, I think in the very near future we'll have some really interesting conversations on the program. So I guess just wrapping up this discussion, then maybe we can just spend a couple of minutes commenting on another aspect of Castoriadis' thought. We've talked about autonomy and heteronomy, and maybe we can just very briefly just talk about this other idea of barbarism and the idea that society losing its capacity for critical self-reflection and sliding into barbarism. What does that mean? Say more about what that means.
Well, barbarism is found in the dilemma that the journal posed: socialism ou barbarie, socialism or barbarism. This slogan, socialism or barbarism, I think comes from Rosa Luxemburg, which pointed that as the big dilemma of the future and of the 20th century, socialism or barbarism. We should point out that this notion of barbarism that Castoriadis used, I think comes from the German idealistic philosophical tradition, from Schiller, Friedrich Schiller, who in his letters for an aesthetic education of man in 1795 pointed out a distinction between the wild, how can I say, situation, the wilderness, the savagery, and barbarism. Schiller said that savagery is what we have in mind as a natural condition of people without social institutions. It's an imaginary, fictitious condition, but that is what he pointed out. However, barbarism is something that emerges in a civilized society when people begin to idolize their stereotypes and begin to worship their ideas as gods and lose their ability of self-reflection and critical mind. In, for example, a technocratic society is, for Schiller, a barbarous society. And I think that this notion of barbarism was carried forth to the revolutionary movement and the revolutionary tradition. When Castoriadis talks about barbarism, he means this complete capitalist alienation of individuals and mechanization, bureaucratization of social life, where everything becomes, how can I say, idolized in a heteronomous way, fetishized, and people become forget their ability to self-reflect and criticize. However, in his later works, this notion of barbarism was replaced or transformed in the notion of insignificancy, in the notion that modern society has lost its ability to produce a positive meaning of life and just continues in a more continues to impose how can I say, an emptiness of living, just suspending social life to consumerism and lack of participation and lack of political questioning and a general lack of interest about the commons and politics. That is insignificance, which Castoriadis, I think we would say, was the most modern capitalist form of barbarism. And at the same time, the most modern capitalist form of alienation and heteronomy. So insignificance is the consumerist, how can I say, reincarnation of barbarism. And the barbarism is the religious reincarnation of heteronomy. So we can find this trend in these meanings. In significance for Castoriadis was an era after 1970, after the May of '68, that was defined by the lack of a revolutionary project and the withering of the project of autonomy, where Western societies delved into individualism, consumerism, and were, how can I say, controlled by the television and all these means of propaganda. But I should point out, and I'm sure that you can say something about that, Chris, that in our book we argue that this age of insignificance has ended, and we have moved on to an age of open crisis, of hot crisis, where all dominant significations are shaken, where the question of authority is being put in forth, and where we have also a horizon of new barbarism coming forth. We have this threat of that we have pointed out in our book, and we express in this notion of a decisive moment.
Yes, for me, the era of insignificance is a paralyzing notion in many respects. Even if I know that I should be acting, and the world is incapable, society is incapable of critical self-reflection, and it's just the mass production of meaninglessness. I find that acting in that context is still quite depressing. So what we've tried to identify in this century, in our time, because he was living in a very different time, is the vibrant social movements that we've mentioned some of them. There's many more: Black Lives Matter, Trans Lives Matter, so many more movements, post-colonial movements that are inspiring, and those just being that being one characteristic, defining a new period, but another characteristic being ideological conflict. Yes, there are segments of society that are incapable of self-reflection and are even dehumanizing whole populations, and this that's and I'm referring those people who are capable of dehumanizing other peoples and communities and populations. I'm referring to the far right, the fascists, the neo-Nazi movements that have emerged so far in this century as well. And so we're seeing a period of ideological conflict that we've not seen since the Cold War days. It's represented in different ways. We have leftist movements and rightist movements vying for power, for electoral power. We've just gone through a very significant period of that with the Labour Party here in the UK, which under Jeremy Corbyn, and with Bernie Sanders and the DSA and everything. Now we're obviously in a different period, but the something has shifted in terms of what people think is capable on the horizon in terms of social change. And in many ways, people might still view the electoral arena as where they can put their energy towards for change, whereas we're proposing, to look at this, public space, public deliberation, shared experiences as a common ground to build from. But it's the ideological conflict that characterizes this period as well. We saw with the invasion of the Capitol building in DC at the beginning of this year. That social conflict and ideological conflict is unfolding, And the base that was activated, the far right base during Trump's era in power, hasn't just gone away. They're there actively organizing still. But, the other characteristic of this decisive moment being that the crisis, the social and material ecological crisis that we experience in our with people and the planet, an ecological crisis that's on everybody's minds, and huge divisions of wealth and power that we've talked about, and the crisis of social imaginary significations being the fourth characteristic defining this decisive moment. The fact that large segments of the population are critical or have been critical of capitalism, and that opinions and perspectives that are critical of capitalism have been emerging in the West. Critical opinions have been emerging in the West significantly. So we just can't take it for granted that everybody believes that capitalism is the ideal economic form, but that's not the only social imaginary signification that we're struggling with, or that's we see as an opportunity for elucidating, to use the Castoriadian term, new possibilities for the project of autonomy. There's a crisis of social imaginary significations occurring everywhere, but predominantly with people just being very concerned about their futures, not sure how they're going to survive in the very near future, how they're going to make if they're ever going to be able to buy a home, if they're ever going to have a home to live in, if they're live paycheck to paycheck, if they're going to be able to afford their tuition fees, if they're going to be able to pay the bills next month. What's going to happen to their children, what's going to happen to their grandchildren, is there going to be a world for the grandchildren to live in 100 years from now? These are all questions which raise doubt about the predominant and dominant forms of being that we're experiencing. So yes, the idea of trying to move away from barbarism, the slide to barbarism, move out of the period of insignificance through an engagement with those those characteristics that define the era that we're living in. That's something that we also try to kind of push forward throughout the text.
And if I may, as a conclusion to our the discussion tonight, I am very happy that we managed to write this book, Castoriadis and Autonomy in the 21st century, by trying to track those social transformations that happen around us, and their perspectives and the horizons of opportunity or for barbarism or liberation that lie beyond them, using Castoriadis' philosophical and conceptual apparatus. And I was very, how can I say, I'm very satisfied that we managed to use these concepts and explain some trends moving until the pandemic of COVID-19 and the rise of the internet. I think that Castoriadis' ideas are a fertile ground for explaining phenomena that Castoriadis himself did not have the chance to witness or experience. And I think that this concept of autonomy, we will have the opportunity to exemplify and explain in all the discussions that are coming in this podcast, since it is the nucleus and the essence of this political project. And if I may quote one small sentence by Castoriadis himself, because I think that as he describes his aspiration for writing the imaginary institution and making this rupture with the traditional, I think we share the same aspiration. So if I may quote just one sentence, Castoriadis says, "We want to show the possibility and render explicit the meaning of the revolutionary project as the project of transforming society into a society organized and oriented toward fostering the autonomy of all, this transformation being accomplished by the autonomous action of human beings such as they are produced by present society. So that is what where we want to track, the possibility of autonomy today, not just the social historical conditions of autonomy in an abstract way, but the possibility of autonomy in our lives collectively today in order to continue our contribution in this battle of significations, in order to actively prevent ourselves from descending into barbarism, which, as we see, is a way that is forced by the dominant institutions of state and capital.
So I guess that's a good place to end it. Unless Nikos, what Nico?
Ναι, μιας και μιλάγαμε για τη βαρβαρότητα, λέει ο Καστοριάδης, κυνηγώ τάχα τη χήμερα να θέλω να εξαλείψω την τραγική πλευρά της ανθρώπινης ύπαρξης. Αναρωτιέται. Μου φαίνεται μάλλον πως θέλω να εξαλείψω από αυτήν το μελόδραμα, την ψεύτικη τραγωδία, γιατί η βαρβαρότητα στην οποία ζούμε είναι σίγουρο ότι δεν είναι μια τραγωδία, δεν είναι κάτι αναπόφευκτο. Και αν υπάρχει μια στιγμή την οποία πρέπει να αποφασίσουμε κάτι, είναι αυτή τώρα που η κοινωνία διαπιστώνει αυτή την κατάσταση σε όλο τον κόσμο, σε όλη την ανθρωπότητα. Φαίνεται αυτό από τις τάσεις που ακροθυγώς πιάσαμε πριν. Μπορούμε σε άλλα podcast να μιλήσουμε πιο καλά. Είναι το ζήτημα το ότι θα πρέπει πλέον να καταλάβουμε ότι το ζήτημα είναι ποιος αποφασίζει. Όπως όλοι το ξέρουν αυτό, ότι το ζήτημα είναι ποιος αποφασίζει. Ακόμα και ο Μάρξ έλεγε στον πολίτη Όουεν στο μισθός τιμή κέρδος ότι το ζήτημα είναι ποιος έχει την πολιτική εξουσία στο τέλος. Όλοι το γνωρίζουμε αυτό. Άρα λοιπόν, ας δούμε τη σκέψη του Καστοριάδη και στη συνέχεια και τις πολιτικές προτάσεις.
Nikos says Castoriadis wrote that it is not a chimera because we are not trying to erase the tragedy aspect or the tragic dimension from the human life. What we are trying to do is erase the melodramatic dimension of the human life, because the barbarism that we live in today is not inevitable. It is not a tragedy, but it is just a stupidity if we eliminate ourselves under the nuclear holocaust or under an ecological catastrophe. So Nikos points out that we are in a decisive moment where we need to make those decisions, not only because we are under, for the first time in history, under the threat of global extinction, but also because we are in a moment where society has understood the emptiness of traditional and dominant institutions of power and has understood that the ultimate question is who makes the decisions, who makes the political decisions. This is something that the revolutionary thinkers knew about. Marx also has written about in his writings about the salary and profit, where he says to the citizen Owen, the ultimate question is who makes the political decisions. And that is something that we are trying to discuss in public space, but also amongst us. And that is a thing that we will discuss in our podcast as well.
Excellent. So we haven't planned our next episode yet, but we are doing so imminently. But definitely follow us on social media to hear about what's coming next. You can join our Facebook group, Castoriadis and Autonomy Facebook group, to get updates, news and announcement. And you can also go to our book website to find out more information. We are broadcasting Wednesday, some time zones that hopefully you're nearby that you can relate to, or are 11:30 a.m. San Francisco, 2:30 p.m. New York, 7:30 p.m. London, 9:30 p.m. Athens, and yeah, we'll be announcing what's coming on the program very soon. So, good night, everyone, and I hope you have a good evening or day wherever you're at. Have a good rest of your day.
Good night, everyone.